morning. Happy Valentine's Day. It's a little nippy out there. I don't know if you noticed. It's in the mid-20s, and I like that. You may have noticed by my piercing blue eyes and my stern Nordic phenotype, I have Scandinavian ancestry, so I'm the son of ice and snow. And Javi, the Allfather, decreed that ours would be the mastery as far as our longships could carry us. So all that to say, when it's cold and I feel that sting on my cheeks, my Viking blood memories trigger, and my power levels rise, which means this presentation will be probably about 10% more factual than it would have been if it were warmer out. So that's very fortuitous for you, right? I'm just, it all hums a little better when it's cold out because I feel the ancestors looking down on me. So what I'm going to try to do over the next hour or so is give you a look at what's going on in the economy and kind of an outlook for the coming year. And the big question that we have essentially is the economy reaching some level of normalization after the pandemic, right? That's kind of the million-dollar question. And this is a lot harder to answer than it seems. There's been a lot of uncertainty in how to interpret different economic indicators. We had a lot of what I would call plot lines over the last year that would seem to be rather grim, right? We had bank failures for the first time in over a decade, like bona fide bank runs, banks going belly up. We had layoffs in the tech sector. We had the two largest financial institutions in the West, JP Morgan and the American Federal Reserve. Both of them explicitly in their staff forecasts predicted a recession at some point in 2023. We didn't get one. Right? So it's actually more difficult than it sounds to parse through the economic data, but that's what we want to do. So let me just give a little bit of context here. I want to remember where we were at a year ago. Okay, so let's look back to Q1 2023, and we had some interesting things happening, right? Okay, Silicon Valley Bank, you may remember this. It was a pretty big deal, particularly since this was a venture capital bank linked to a lot of tech startups in California, which according to us would indicate that they're maybe above the curve on competence, but they had a full-on bank failure, right? So we had this fear that there was going to be contagion and widespread collapse in the banking sector. Financial collapse, if you're not familiar, is bad, okay? So we had that going on. Then we had JP Morgan in March officially, formally putting a recession into their staff forecast for 2023. Okay, and JP Morgan is the largest private financial institution in America, so they employ a staff of what I would consider to be nominally competent economists, right? Certainly well credentialed. And they use this language, past the point of no return, which to me sounds like they have a pretty high degree of certainty in their forecasts. So we'll see how that panned out. Then, of course, we had a massive increase in layoffs in the tech sector. And this really tends to freak people out because in America today, we tend to presume that tech companies are the smartest companies out there, right? And this is because, they wear sweatpants to work. They're clearly on some sort of higher plane of competence, so cognitively extreme that us normies cannot comprehend it, okay? So if there's layoffs in the tech sector, this tends to be viewed by most people as sort of the canary in the coal mine that the labor market is about to sour. And then finally, the Fed jumped on board in April, and they added a recession to their forecast as well. Okay, so this, essentially Q1 last year, looks really not good, to use a technical term, okay? Layoffs, bank failures, forecasts baked into the recession, and yet, to me, this looks pretty much okay, right? So the blue line there that's GDP, right? So that's GDP. You do have the big drop from COVID, but then after COVID, this is pretty much just sort of trundling up to the top corner. Same with employment. Drop from COVID, rapid recovery, and then it's basically a straight line towards the upper right-hand corner. And what they teach you in an economics program is essentially that all meaningful and good things in life are in the top right-hand corner of your graph, okay? So the big lines that control our fates, they're going in the right direction. Okay, and this speaks to just sort of this broader confusion, and we even see this on the level of the consumer. one interesting thing that we've noticed over the last year is if you ask consumers questions about the economy. So for example, if you ask a consumer, do you think the economy is growing? Do you think the job market is producing enough jobs? They answer optimistically. But if you ask them financial questions like, is this a good time to buy a house, right? Are you considering major purchases right now? They answer pessimistically. So there seems to be this weird tension, understanding that maybe there's strain from prices, some of the esoteric financial indicators do not look so good, but the bones of the economy, output, employment, these look very, very stable. So we want to parse through that. And when we come back to these stories that we were talking about, right, the Fed conducted a stress test of the financial sector and concluded that there were a handful of banks where evidently they did not take Finance 101, which would tell you not to sit on a long bond position in a rising rate environment. And aside from those banks that committed what was essentially a pretty elementary financial mistake, the broader banking sector was quite healthy, passed the stress test. JP Morgan was just kidding. They dropped the recession from their staff forecast and said, actually, the economy's going to grow. Sorry about that. Tech layoffs. It turns out that what was going on with the tech sector wasn't really economic collapse. It was more what we would call kind of trimming bull market fat, right? After a long period of zero rates, bull markets kind of slimming down a little bit. So there were layoffs, but this didn't translate into broader economic issues. And then finally, the Fed was just kidding too. They dropped their recession from their forecast. So everything looks like we've kind of weathered this storm. So we want to figure out, and you'd be rational asking, right, if these massively overcompensated economists at JP Morgan are whiplashing like this analytically, does anyone actually know what's going on? Well, I do, so I'm going to tell you. So we want to talk about inflation, the labor market, and demographics, and get sort of a holistic look at what's going on in the economy. So let's start off by talking about inflation. This is your benchmark look at inflation. This is CPI growth year over year. You can very obviously see this big run up after COVID where we're dealing with, 8-9% year over year inflation. And this has come down quite a bit. Now, what we have to say about inflation is that this is very poorly explained to American households because economists like to get up, point at this graph, and say, what are you complaining about? Look, year over year CPI growth it was 3.1 last month. So, we've made a lot of progress, rate of inflation has come down, and you should stop complaining. But we're doing a disservice because we have to acknowledge most Americans don't really actually care about what the benchmark CPI year-over-year growth rate is. What they want is their old prices back, okay? And this actually has no bearing on whether their old prices are returning. We have to remember, we've had 3 years of elevated inflation. This is a metric that compounds, right? And so at this point, consumer prices, depending on the category, are 30 to 40% higher than they were in 2018. Okay? And so when we talk about how the rate of change has come down and it's slowing, all you're doing is putting the brake on a multi-year run-up in consumer prices. So it would be foolish to look at this and suggest that American consumers don't have viable complaints about prices, right? They absolutely do after multiple years of price run-up. However, it is good that we're putting the brake on it. Now, what we obviously want to ask is a twofold question. Number one, why did inflation prove so stubborn over the last couple of years, right? Because the Fed used that word, they said it was transitory, which kind of was a way of saying, please ignore it, maybe it'll go away on its own. That clearly did not pan out. So why did inflation prove to be not transitory, and when will it come down to that really nice, cozy 1% to 2% range, which is where we like it to be? Because that's where we actually can ignore it, when it becomes a really nominal low term. Okay, so let's answer those questions. And most people want to blame either the COVID pandemic and its effect on supply chains, or they want to blame the stimulus programs that were initiated during the pandemic. And that's because people really like monocausal explanations for things. The reality is that it was the concatenation of these two events that triggered inflation. So let's talk about this. So supply chains. We had a massive run-up in the price of raw materials over the last few years. So this is net raw material price growth. And you know what? I really don't care if you want to read the numbers or look at that. Like, all that really matters is colors, shapes, where the arrow's pointing. So if you can see that this is going up, that's really all that matters. Because I realized I think I put the axis in like 12-point font, so I don't know if you can read it. I like small font. I don't know. Maybe it's some sort of neuroticism. Anyway, so raw materials by 2022 were 50% more expensive across the board than they were pre-pandemic. Why? Well, the assumption is that it's due to the disruption to shipping, right? And in a sense that's true, but I want to explain the mechanism. See, people assume that the reason shipping impacts prices is because it's a price pass-through game. Shipping companies have to, they're waiting longer, have to pay more for fuel, they have to pay more for insurance, and so they pass that on to the consumer. That's actually not the main mechanism for inflation. The main mechanism is shortages, okay? And a great example for this can be found in what's going on right now in the Red Sea. The Al-Ansar movement, which we popularly know as the Houthis, which to me, that's actually kind of a cute name, right? So it kind of underplays their capacity. They're actually a fairly sophisticated military entity. They've been shooting rockets at shipping in the Red Sea. And so what does that do to the economy on a macro scale? Well, let's kind of work this out. So the benchmark shipping route that gets used kind of as the basis of understanding what's going on here is the route from Shanghai to Rotterdam, okay? And that's because essentially that's China's main port to Europe's busiest port, okay? So this is a proxy for more broadly what's going on with shipping. When you can sail up through the Red Sea and use the Suez Canal, it takes a container ship about 33 days to get from Shanghai to Rotterdam. Might be longer than you would think, right? Because we can crisscross the globe instantly, but these are large, ponderous vessels, so it's a good month's journey. When you cannot use the Red Sea because there are rockets flying around, and you have to go around Africa, that is a 57-day journey. So that increase in the distance reduces the net capacity of the shipping system because containers are locked up in transit, ships are locked up in transit. When you think about this, it's a 70% increase in the length of the journey, and something like 20% of global shipping goes through the Red Sea. So just for context, if the Red Sea is offline for an extended period of time, the net capacity of global shipping to move product is reduced by somewhere between 5 and 8%, okay? So that just means, on aggregate, the global economy can move up to 8% less volume of everything: petroleum, sheet aluminum, fertilizer, chemical inputs, consumer goods, rubber, on and on and on it goes. That is the mechanism for inflation because that creates shortages, okay? So fundamentally, we have to understand that what's going on with supply chains, which continues to linger, right? The effects of the pandemic wound down, but we have other issues that are disrupting supply chains, like war between Russia and Ukraine, kinetic action in the Red Sea. These reduce the capacity of global shipping to move product, and it creates shortages for consumers. And so we need to understand we're not dealing with a price pass-through game. It's not just, they have to burn more fuel because it's a longer trip and the price of the fuel gets trickled down. It's literally about shortages of materials and products that drive prices up, okay? So that's the primary mechanism, and that's what we're still dealing with. So you see that this has come down. We have seen raw material prices ease, but they're still significantly elevated relative to pre-pandemic levels, okay? And this is causing nagging, stubborn price elevation for consumers. The problem is that this occurred simultaneously with a major shock to the demand side of the economy in the form of those wonderful stimulus checks. Okay, so we remember stimulus checks. That was pretty cool. Now we have to first clarify that this was a case of, this is why you should try to be explicit when you're making a joke, okay? Economists had this sort of tongue-in-cheek line. We called it helicopter money. You may have heard this. And the idea was that you would joke, well, if you had a really bad recession and the economy was really bogged down, you could just print some cash and throw it out of a helicopter. and then people would pick it up and spend it, and then the economy is saved, right? And so this was just sort of a thought experiment to demonstrate how certain strains of Keynesian fiscal stimulus work, et cetera, et cetera. But then they actually did it, right? So they used direct deposit instead of the helicopter drop, which I was not in favor of because the helicopter drop has the advantage of disproportionately benefiting people with long arms or butterfly nets. So it has this sort of Nietzschean phenomenon to it where the weak fear the strong. The direct deposit was more egalitarian, it had less potential to spark riots, people trying to scoop up cash, so that was probably good. But this was essentially a helicopter drop of money for really the first time anyone had ever actually tried that. And what that meant was that the American consumer was sitting on something like $6 trillion in extra cash coming out of the pandemic. Above and beyond what they had before. And remember, it wasn't just the stimulus checks, it was also student loan payments being deferred. It was rents being deferred. You had PPI loans to businesses. You had expanded unemployment benefits. So through a variety of mechanisms, a huge amount of cash got dumped into consumers' bank accounts. And what does that mean for inflation? Well, there's this arcane concept in economics, very old, we call it supply and demand, right? And this suggests that in the face of rising prices, consumers will spend less. That seems rational. You kind of go into a financial siege mode, you try to increase your savings, bunker down, you spend less, try to ride out the inflation, and that acts as a brake on the inflation since it slows economic activity. Well, turns out that doesn't work if people have a bunch of extra money sitting in their checking accounts. And furthermore, we have observed that people tend to be more aggressive spending unearned income. They actually tested this in casinos, right? So believe it or not, economists would just sit around casinos and give people money and then watch how they would gamble it. And they would observe people are much more aggressive gambling like a $100 bill that they've just been given over their own money. Right? So there's this sort of added income recklessness that we all experienced en masse as the pandemic ended. So prices begin to rise. What does the consumer do? They don't throttle back their spending. They actually stomp on the gas. Okay? So this is what we have here. This is American consumer spending adjusted for inflation, looking at the year-over-year growth. So it's rather interesting that the year that inflation was at its peak, consumer spending went up 7% year over year. And this is essentially because the effects of the stimulus meant the consumer was blind to inflation for the first couple of years. They just didn't care because they had $6 trillion on aggregate just sloshing around, burning a hole in their pockets. So it was the concatenation of these events. COVID disrupting supply chains, war in Eastern Europe and in the Red Sea extending that turmoil, and a consumer that simply did not care thanks to the stimulus checks, okay? And when you put these two things together, you have a perfect recipe for a little bit of runaway inflation that is not transitory, okay? That's the inflation story. So the next thing we have to ask and try to parse out is whether inflation can come down further, right? We just had a CPI print yesterday. It was at 3.1. Is a decent number, but we'd like to see it come lower. The Fed officially would like it to be down at 2 before they kind of declare victory. So we want to ask, is the macroeconomy consistent with 2% inflation? Is that realistic? And my argument is that it really is not due to constraints in the labor market. So let's talk about that. Okay, we have to understand the American labor market is massively overheated. Okay, so this line just shows you how many jobs do we have to fill in the country? This is unfilled positions. You can see a big run up after COVID. To us, we expected that. We said, okay, a lot of people were laid off, restaurants, hotels, things like that. As the economy reopens, there's going to be a surge in open positions as they try to bring people back to work. What we didn't expect was that this would, well, I expected it, but what other people didn't expect, you'll see why. There's arcane secret knowledge that lets you crack this, okay? So What people did not expect was that this line would stay elevated, okay? So right now we still have about 10 million unfilled jobs in the country. That's several million excess above what we had pre-COVID. And what I want to draw your attention to is the little black dot in the bottom right corner. That's the number of people we have on unemployment in the country, okay? So this sets up what we call a math problem, where you have less than 2 million unemployed on the unemployment rolls, and you have about 10 million jobs to fill. Quick math tells me that you can, at best, fill maybe 1 out of 5 open positions, which means 80% of the jobs to fill in the United States cannot be filled. Okay, there simply are not base inputs to fill them, and remember, the base input in the economy is a warm Homo sapien, right? It's an ambulatory, cardiovascularly active human being to perform some sort of task, okay? That is what we have a shortage of, is people, okay? So we have an extraordinary mismatch right now between labor supply and labor demand. So we want to figure out why. And so this becomes sort of the million-dollar question, the structural question at the heart of the US economy. How can we adequately meet the labor demands of the economy, okay? Or can we at all? Okay, so let's talk about some things. These are the conventional bullet points that get blamed for the labor shortage. Okay, so we'll run down this. Number one is what we call skill level mismatch. So at this point, I get to teach you about how techno-bureaucratic jargon works, right? As a tool to evade accountability, which is really the ultimate goal of public life, right? So how many of you have heard of soft skills? Okay, decent amount. For those who don't know, soft skills essentially refers to the following very complex skill set. Can you show up on time for your interview? Please don't lie during your interview, and then don't steal on the way out, okay? That is soft skills. Now, I have always thought of this as ethics, okay? But it sounds bad to say we have an ethical crisis. So instead, we call it soft skills because now, instead of deliberating about some sort of metastasizing civilizational rot at the heart of the West, we just need a training program, right? So this is how you turn metaphysical degradation of the civilization into just a nice little jobs, training program, and then we feel better. Okay, so skill level mismatch, soft skills. This is essentially the sanitized way of saying there's a strata of the American population that is not suitable for employment due to problems like criminality, substance abuse. Sometimes it's just a really appalling lack of basic job and social skills. There is a strata of the population that has that problem, and so they're not capable of holding a job. We tend to see these people as what we call repeat customers on unemployment, where they have a series of unemployments very fast. They'll get a job and just lose it almost instantly. So that is a problem, right? All right, we can blame teens. And this is always fun because teens, no one will defend them. So teen work rates are at historic lows right now. And this may sound like stereotypical complaining about Gen Z, and certainly Gen Z has its share of parasocial abnormalities, but statistically, they have the worst work rates of any generation in history. Okay? You can look at the work rates for teenagers and you see it plummet over the last decade as Gen Z becomes the bulk of the teen population. Okay, so teen work rates are very low. That certainly hurts industries like hospitality, restaurants, retail, etc. However, we have shortages of very, very important, technically sophisticated occupations like trauma surgeons, programmers, artillerymen in the Army, occupations not conventionally held by 16-year-olds. So we can't blame them for the entirety of the labor shortage. We can probably blame them for exacerbating hiring problems in restaurants, right? That would be fair. But we can't pin the whole thing on them, as convenient as that would be. Okay. We know that we have issues with disabilities and substance abuse. This has become a growing problem over the last decade. Childcare availability always gets thrown out as a cause of the labor shortage. Often families either cannot find childcare, or especially if they have multiple young children, they won't break even on their second income paying for childcare. And then we can blame, gig work, informal employment, more freelance work, driving for Uber, things like that. Okay, so these are the things that will conventionally get blamed for why we don't have workers. And my argument is essentially that these are a blip statistically with really minimal impacts on the broader labor force when you consider all things in aggregate. We actually have to blame some of my favorite people, baby boomers, shockingly. So let's talk about that. What I want to emphasize, though, this is the labor force participation rate, which is just the broad measure of what percentage of the adult population is working. It's sort of the high-level measurement of your population's productive proclivities, so to speak. You can see a drop after COVID. Everything dropped after COVID. So just for disclosure, fundamentally, economists are extremely petty people, okay? So there is widespread disgruntlement about the fact that the pandemic permanently gunked up our graphs, right? Because now everything has this, like a shark fin in it, this big divot where the pandemic was. And so obviously COVID was a sort of once in a century societal disruption it touched every dimension of society. But for us, the core of the problem is that we have these weird abnormalities in our spreadsheets. And so that's what we've got here. We've got another drop after COVID. But look, this is kind of recovering. This seems to be trending up. So if you're thinking about falling work rates as a short-term problem in the economy, like it's a lingering effect of the pandemic that we're trying to ride out, you really are not addressing the actual problem here because and this is where I expose graphic trickery, right? So this starts in 2020. This is a graph that I saw in a major business publication, I won't say which one, arguing that work rates are pretty much okay. They've mostly recovered from the pandemic. But look what happens when I wind this graph back, not to 2020, but many decades, okay? That little box down there in the corner, that's COVID and the aftermath, okay? So when we talk about falling work rates and the loss of labor availability, we're fundamentally not talking about a phenomenon caused by COVID. We're talking about an indicator, a major social indicator that's been in decline for decades, okay? So we need to be thinking not about 2020 onward, but essentially 1995 onward, right? Work rates peaked in the late 90s and have been in decline since then. So we need to grapple with why this very important social indicator is in a state of multi-decade collapse. Now, you might be noticing this and thinking, well, look at that axis. First off, why is it in 12-point font? But secondly, look, we're talking about, maybe 5 percentage points. Is that really that significant? Keep in mind, we're talking about 5 percentage points off of an adult population of over 200 million, right? So we're talking about not just millions, we're talking about well in excess of 10 million people missing from the labor force, okay? We want to know what happened to them. And the reality is that what happened to them, so to speak, is the tragedy of chronological progression and aging, okay? So when we try to decompose this and figure out what happened to the labor force, it turns out the vast majority of it is due to retirements. Again, I apologize for the small font size. That's kind of readable. Okay, the blue, so this pie chart is basically all the people missing from the labor force, okay? The blue is retirement, okay? And that accounts for about 8 million of the decrease. The green, the other significant portion here, represents the fact that people are in school longer, right? College enrollments have risen over time. More people go to grad school. There's pretty much more people at every level of post-secondary education than there used to be. And people are less likely to work while they're in school, okay? So the blue and the green, which account for 85% of the decrease in labor force, represent essentially baby boomers retiring and younger generations being less likely to work while they're in school than parent generations. Those two factors account for the vast majority of the missing labor force. And obviously, retirements dominate of these two forces. So when you talk about all those other things, right? The shadow labor force, substance abuse and disability, that's the little black and gray wedge. It's about 15% of the overall labor shortage, and it ends up becoming fairly marginal in the grand scheme of things when we're talking about this long-term decline in work rates in the United States. So we want to know why this is, and it's really not that hard to figure out. The problem is that the baby boomers are selfish and think they deserve to retire. No, I'm kidding. So let's talk about why retirements have skyrocketed and caused this degradation of the labor force. And it all comes down to this very uncomfortable social indicator, but it's actually the most important indicator in social sciences, really in forecasting the history or the trajectory of a society. And that's the birth rate, family size, right? So you need 2.1 children per family to have a population that's stable over time. And you might be thinking, why is it 2.1, right? Shouldn't it basically be 2? Because it's 2 children, 2 parents. You have to account for adolescent male risk appetite and stupidity, right? So adolescent males do things like they go crabbing in the Bering Sea, and they jump off of objects, and conduct various other forms of adrenaline-seeking behavior, and suffer early male death, okay? So, or dismemberment. So, disfigurement, that's what I was looking for. Yeah, so you need like a 0.1 extra on your birth rate to account for early death, which is almost exclusively male and almost exclusively self-inflicted. That's why, see, nature is so cool. 51 out of 100 babies born are male, because it's like you need a couple extra in the bank, because they're going to eliminate themselves from the population pool. Okay, so you need 2.1 children per family for your population to be stable over time. Note, stable. That's not growth. That would be a stagnant population over an extended period of time. But in the United States, we've been well below that for most of the last 50 years. Okay? Now, I want you to note, look at how high this was in the 60s, okay, where I wind up the graph. That's baby boomers coming on board, right? That's why there's so many baby boomers. It's because they were the last generation born in the era of plus replacement birth rates, okay? So the baby boomers were born in an era where the average family had almost 4 children, okay? And when that's the norm, you end up with a lot of baby boomers. Okay, now, this indicator can seem, kind of esoteric, irrelevant. Why are we spending so much time on this? But this is what makes or breaks societies. And my favorite example of this is South Korea, right? South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world. It's about 0.7 right now. And South Korea is interesting for 2 reasons. Number one, South Korea is a very prosperous, successful society, right? The only other country with a birth rate even comparable would be Ukraine. But Ukraine has a lot of, let's call them extenuating circumstances. We're not going to hold, this doesn't necessarily signal some larger pathology in Ukraine, right? We're going to give them a pass. South Korea is a very prosperous, very stable, healthy, highly educated society, right? If you're looking at human development indicators, South Korea, frankly, would be a pretty awesome country to get born into. But their birth rate is appallingly low at 0.7. What does that mean? Well, 0.7 means that with every passing generation, the population reduces by more than half. So just to put some context on this, if your birth rate was 0.7 over multiple generations, after 4 generations, the population would basically be 5% of what it originally was, okay? And we don't like to think about these compounding indicators over time, but that's the reality of it. South Korea, a highly educated, highly prosperous society, has a social indicator that at the heart of things means they're on an extinction path. And that's really not an exaggeration. It's not sustainable over time. This can lead to the collapse or even extinction of societies as we know them. And so just think about that. South Korea, in peacetime, with a very stable, healthy economy, is essentially on a path to slash its population to a small fraction of its base. And so we need to understand the birth rate is very, very important for that reason, okay? So what happens when the birth rate is low and dropping over time? Essentially, you accumulate a demographic deficit that eventually you have to pay for. And that's what we're paying for right now. Now, we have to look at the broader structure of the population. This is a population pyramid. It's a pretty standard way of presenting demographics. You have male and female on opposite sides. The reason for that is actually in societies that have had traumatic events like war, for example, you can see losses in population predominantly male. So for example, if I were to show you Germany, Germany had large holes taken out of the male side from the world wars, right? America thankfully doesn't have a huge imbalance due to war because we won World War II. It's a nice little perk. But we have male, female on opposite sides. Each bar represents the population size of a 5-year age block. So for example, bottom left-hand bar, we have 10 million little girls between 0 and 5 years old, and then 5 to 10 years old, and so on and so forth. So you have children on the bottom, working age in the middle, seniors on top. And when you see a bulge or like a scoop taken out, it represents a demographic imbalance. So right up here, these are the baby boomers. And we love them, don't we, folks? You know, they dominated the American economic and cultural life for 40 years. They generated more wealth than any generation before them, and there are 71 million of them right now. That's actually less than there used to be because the oldest boomers are now in their late 70s, right? So we're starting to see decline in boomer numbers. I realize this sounds like I'm talking about an antelope herd or something like, but you know, this is very important, the size of these generations. Okay. Below the baby boomers, we have Gen X, and then, yeah, woohoo. So Gen X suffers for a variety of reasons. Okay, number one, they are small, right, objectively. 66 million. So at their peak, the baby boomers outnumbered by Gen X by like 10 million people. Okay, so they were pretty significantly outnumbered. They're also not doing anything particularly interesting at the moment from a demographic perspective. So where Gen X is at in life cycle, they're not retiring yet. They're no longer having children. They're not in school. They just get up and go to work and pay their taxes, which is very important, but it's not like exciting. You know, they're not really rocking the boat. So it's kind of this well-behaved middle child generation. They have great social indicators, high work rates, low criminality, everything you love to see. The other reason Gen X is kind of you know, they don't get talked about so much is they've been less assertive about the superiority of their music compared to boomers, for example. Even though I think Phil Collins has really had some staying power with millennials and some popularity with later generations. But you know, they weren't as fully assertive about their total cultural superiority as the way boomers were. So that's Gen X. And then we have millennials. Now, millennials are the most important people that have ever lived. And I will show you why in a minute, okay? So there are 72 million millennials, which is a relatively large generation. The reason there are so many millennials is because there were so many boomers, right? Large parent generation, you get a large child generation, even though the boomers didn't quite hit 2 kids apiece. It was close enough that you had a pretty good sized generation come out. And then we run into our problem, which is Gen Z. Okay. So Gen Z has several issues. Their brains are malformed because they got smartphones when they were young. They didn't have to pay for them like millennials did. You know, like millennials got social media and smartphones when our brains were mostly developed. Gen Z still had a high degree of neuroplasticity and they were just not cognitively equipped to cope with this. So they have some weird things, like they prefer to watch people play video games, right? They watch streamers instead of like actually playing themselves, which I do not understand. You end up with this enormous cultural rift where it's much easier for me to talk to my boomer uncles than like my Gen Z cousins, even though the age gap is much smaller. Although I'm 31 now, so I'm gonna die soon anyway, and I don't understand these people. But that's not the problem for our purposes. The problem for our purposes is twofold. Number one, they're small, right? It's only about 67 million of them. And number two, They do not have great work habits. Their work rates are low, just objectively, statistically. So we're setting ourselves up for a very difficult trade-off. You have a 71 million strong generation that had very good work habits, high work rates, retiring, and a 67 million strong generation with inferior work habits coming in the bottom to replace them. So even if the work habits were equivalent, we are short several million people on the handoff between these generations. But the work habits are not equivalent, which exacerbates the issue. The other problem is that baby boomers are not equally concentrated in the economy, right? They are overwhelmingly more likely to be in managerial roles, for one. So you don't really want to slot in someone from Gen Z to replace them. You end up with institutional voids as they retire. But do you want to guess what two occupations have the highest concentration of baby boomers? Trucking and farming. Now, that worries me because I have always found that caloric intake is valuable for life. It's important to sustain biological processes. And you need someone to produce the food and then transport it to have reliable access to adequate calories, right? And yet, something like 60% of our truckers and farmers are baby boomers. The average age of a farmer in the United States is 66 years old, right? So the disproportionate distribution creates further stressors because people are not fully homogenous. They have different skill sets, different interests, and it doesn't appear that Gen Z is, breaking down the gates to get into farming, right? So we have a problem with labor allocation and labor availability. Now let me show you what this looks like on a more timely scale. Okay, this is American labor force post-pandemic. There's the dang shark fin check mark again from COVID. You get a big drop, you get some recovery. Total, the American labor force is 2% larger than it was pre-pandemic. Now, that is anemic growth. That's 2 percentage points of growth over going on 5 years. So we're talking about well under 1% annual growth. Throughout most of the last century, the American labor force grew at 2 or 3% per year, right? So our labor force growth has really shrunk down to nothing. But let me show you what happens when I remove the foreign-born population from this. 0, okay? So the implication of that is the American labor force no longer grows under its own powers, okay? Without the added benefit of immigration, there is no labor force growth in the United States, and there is unlikely to be any labor force growth in the United States. And that is purely baked into the demographics, and there's really nothing you can do about that because if you wanted more 18-year-olds, you needed to do something about that 18 years and 9 months ago, right? There's a very long lag time on new workers coming online in the economy. So demographics do not steer, right? This isn't something that you can just throw together a policy response to and, suddenly we have, oh, well, good news, we found 2 million extra people in their 20 to 25 range and now we've fixed the labor force. Nothing you can do like that. So we need to understand America has reached the point of what we would call demographic exhaustion, and that is being overcome essentially through immigration. Now, people will have their own views on immigration. My job is not to comment on that. It's purely to note that from a mathematical perspective, if you remove immigration from the equation, there's no labor force growth in the country, okay? And so this sets up the larger issue, which is the transition to being a mass retirement society. And that transition stresses every institution in the country. So let me show you the long arc of the American population. This is the broad look at how productive is your population. What percentage of the population is of the working age? Roughly, 16 to 64, 65 years old, right? So look at those boomers go, right? There's so many of them. They drive up the productive capacity of the country because they're a large, young generation, and a large, young population drives labor force growth, drives economic growth. So it's not a coincidence that the economy grew very, very quickly, that we became used to 4% plus GDP growth when the boomers were young. Well, I didn't get used to it. I wasn't there. But I have interacted with it in spreadsheet form, so I'm intimately familiar with what the 70s were like from that perspective. In a way, I know the 70s better than the people who lived it from my extensive experience with the data. So the boomers, big young generation, drive economic growth. Gen X, you're wonderful. There aren't enough of you. I wish there were more. We have a little bit of demographic stagnation while Gen X is the young generation because there just are not enough of them to drive further growth. But then, this is why I say, these world historic heroes, the millennials, the most important people that have ever lived, that ever will live, the sort of, the reason for historical existence itself, they buy an extra decade at the top of the curve. Okay, so the way to think about the millennials is this demographic that backstopped the economy and bought us a decade at the peak. And the reason it worked out this way is because for that decade, we get to double dip on the big generations, right? There's two big generations in America, millennials and boomers, that are notably larger than the rest of the population. And for one perfect, glorious decade, both of them were working. And when both big generations are working simultaneously, you have, for a short passing time, an abundance of workers, and everything looks pretty darn good. And then you run out of millennials. All the millennials are working now. We don't have any more to tap into. The boomers start to turn 65, hundreds of thousands of them every month. They start to retire, and all we have left in the stable to replace them is Gen Z, who are insufficient in quantity, and they have lower work rates. And so you get this interminable slide, right? So the blue dot is where we're at right now. You can see we've already lost a few percentage points off our working age share. And then the blue line is this nice cozy forecast through the end of the century. So fundamentally, the major stressor on the American economy is the fact that we are transitioning over time from a 70% working population to a 60% working population. And that transition is a major stressor on every institution in the country. The most notable examples would be the actuarial health of things like retirement funds, Social Security, and insurance. You can obviously see how this changes the actuarial dynamics there. And healthcare. People over the age of 65 consume 4 times as much healthcare on an annual basis as people under 65, right? So we're looking at a massive explosion in the demand for healthcare in the country at the same time that our pool of potential nurses, doctors, technologists, et cetera, is shrinking very rapidly. And so this transition will stress the entire American system, and it's stressing other countries in exactly the same way. And so obviously the only way out of this is either by shifting the demographic math, either with immigration or pronatality policies, or with automation, right? You have to do more with fewer people. There's a great example of automation in the bathroom, right? We used to have men's room attendants, and now there's like a basket with Mucinex and Tylenol in there. So that's a job that was automated with a basket. Hopefully we can find some more sophisticated cases of job replacement so we can offset this. But barring sufficient technological progress or something that shifts the demographic math, we are in an economically constrained environment, and that's just baked into our demographics. So I will leave you with this concluding thought, since I'm aware that we are sitting in the shadow of a rather popular ski resort, right? So I like to think of demographics and the economy like you're skiing down a glacier, right? And when you're skiing, your objective is fundamentally to not crash into rocks, trees, other skiers, or go into a crevasse. Essentially, you're trying to evade obstacles that can cause injury or death. And I think that that's rational. I'm not really a skier, which I probably should be given my Nordic heritage, but I don't like being wet, so I don't know. That's rational, right? But 100 years later, what is it that has gouged the side out of the mountain and literally made a valley where there was not one before? It's the movement of the glacier under your feet. And you don't really notice it because glaciers move at like 4 inches a year or something like that. By the way, I just have a bone to pick with geologists because they say things like that, you know, like a glacier moves at an inch a year or whatever, something that you can't possibly measure accurately, or they'll be like, oh, it takes 6 billion years for the cooling phase to end. And it's like, how do we even evaluate or see if that's true? Basically, I'm jealous because they're way better at evading accountability than economists are, because their time scales are so long that you can't check it. But anyway, they tell you, oh, the glacier's moving at 2 inches a year or whatever. You don't notice that when you're skiing down it. You're worried about short-term obstacles. And those are things like inflation, shipping issues, monetary policy. But over the long run, over the multi-decade span, it's the movement of the glacier that determines the landscape, and that's demographics, right? Demographics move so slowly under your feet, because we actually age pretty slowly, right? We age at like a year per year, most of us. I know there are like billionaire biohackers who, they're like, oh, I eat a special mushroom and now I only age at 0.8 years per year. But for the rest of us plebs, we age at 1 year per year, which is actually pretty slow. So the lifespan of a generation is long in the labor force. But over the course of 50, 60 years, you really begin to notice the bill that you've accumulated from low birth rates. And we're essentially paying that bill now, even though it took many decades to come due. We feel it now in this labor crunch. So not to say that you shouldn't work hard to avoid near-term obstacles. You don't want to crash into things, but you need to be aware that the ground under you is moving and it's gouging the landscape long-term. So this is like a recap slide, just because people expect that. You don't have to read it. And do we want to take a couple questions? Okay, then I'll do this. Oh yeah. Any questions? Oh man, okay. That's a bigger font. That's good. I can read it. Okay. So AI is obviously this sort of like silver bullet that people are waiting on to unlock a lot of productivity gains. Here's the problem that we have seen so far with technology, AI, automation. We have made visibly enormous technological leaps in the last decade, and yet productivity measurements are pretty flat. Okay, so you would have to be very silly to deny that technology is not advancing very, very quickly, and yet we don't see that showing up in our measurements of worker productivity, which is a little bit odd. And it might be that we're waiting on the application of a lot of these technologies to be perfected. It might simply be that AI doesn't really interface with some of the areas of greatest labor need. But as of yet, these technological advances that we enjoy from a sort of personal convenience standpoint do not seem to be trickling into the productivity measurements. And that's one of the bigger puzzles that economists are trying to figure out, is why is productivity stagnant in an era of rising technological sophistication? One theory I have is that technology has also negative effects on productivity through ubiquitous access to entertainment. And so it's possible that there's some offset going on. But as of yet, we really have not seen a big surge in productivity like you might expect. Other questions? Given the demographic shift, advertising at large, I don't think that it's like advertising is going to change in a vacuum. The entire media ecosystem is changing in a pretty fundamental way, right? And I'm not a marketing professional, but just you can observe the fact that the media preferences of Americans are shifting rapidly. Not only because the boomers are getting older and entering a different phase of how they consume and spend, but Gen Z clearly has radically different preferences when it comes to how they consume media, right? And it's always tempting to think that you are unique in going through sort of an epoch shift, but you have to remember, we went through this in the 1950s too, with the sudden universalization of television, right? So marketing, media consumption, they always go through these phase changes with different preferences from new generations. So I think that that's comforting in a sense. Doesn't mean that things aren't changing quickly, but it does mean that they kind of always change this way in cycles, right? You'd probably have to ask someone from Gen Z, though, like how you advertise to them. I don't consume any of their media. You know, I hear references to like YouTube personalities, and I don't know. I don't get it. Other questions? We wait for the bubble to pop up. This is cool, though. I could leave someone on read, like in front of everybody. That would be a huge power play. Decline workers. That appears to be an incomplete sentence. Workers in trucking and farming, rise of technology. Okay, we'll do that one. Gen Z, slower to enter the workforce. Part of the problem with Gen Z is that when you survey them, they not only have lower work rates in terms of actual hours worked, they seem to have a lower desire to work, even in how they answer surveys about like ideal work schedule, how many hours a week do you want to work, how highly do you value career over other, let's call them parasocial values, right? So Gen Z seems to be more consumption and leisure focused. They seem to be sort of anti-careerist, would almost be a term, which I think it's an almost rational reaction to the fact that Gen X is considered a very hardworking, career-oriented generation. So those are the parents of Gen Z, right? Millennials have spent the last decade complaining about how they got screwed on their student loans, right? And complaining about workplace culture. So the experience that Gen Z has sort of absorbed vicariously from the older generations has made them rather cynical towards a sort of traditional career-oriented life. And you see that in how they answer surveys. Like they seem to have a low desire to work long hours. They also are very cynical about their odds of owning a home, etc. So they don't necessarily see the reward implicit in work. And it's a very interesting problem, right? To have an entire generation that by and large seems cynical about participation in the economy. I mean, it sounds goofy, but that's actually what they tell us when we survey them on their work habits. Do I have any advice on cryptocurrency? I cannot give financial advice as a state employee. All I can tell you is that personally, I hold some Chainlink, but there's always this disclaimer, like, I can't give financial advice. This does not reflect the position of the state of Idaho or the governor of Idaho, Brad Little, blah, blah, blah. Okay, yeah. So no is the answer, I guess. Given demographic declines, do you think there will be replacement for Social Security, or do you think it'll go away? So, long term, Social Security was not actuarially designed for a country with America's current demographic profile. That being said, Social Security politically is almost inviolable as long as the baby boomers are alive. So, long term, Social Security is not viable in a vacuum without changes either to the retirement age, the benefit structure, the tax structure, or some sort of bailing out from general federal revenues, or not revenues, but finances. But I think that it's pretty obvious just from reading the room that you're not going to see a radical restructuring to Social Security anytime soon. Okay, so we'll punt it for a while, and then it'll be worse, and then eventually we'll have to confront the fact, because remember, when Social Security was designed, what was the birth rate? Like 4.2, right? That's the country that this program was actuarially built around, and that's not the country we have anymore. It was at least 12% better than last year. How do we tackle the high cost of childcare and insurance? Gilead Light Society. Okay. Is that a Handmaid's Tale reference? I never saw that. It just looked depressing. I like cheerful shows, like Seinfeld. Radical Costanzatism is my ideology. Anyway, okay, so let me explain the problem with childcare. childcare is a very difficult issue to parse out because childcare is a very, very difficult industry to staff because there are strict legal ratios on the number of children to worker. So particularly for infant childcare, you can have 3 infants per worker. And I used to think that that was like really low. You know, like you need 1 worker for every 3 kids. Then I have my own kid, and now I'm like, I have no clue how you can adequately monitor 3 children at once, because they're really fast. Anyway, so it's difficult to staff because, bluntly, childcare is an industry where it is impossible to increase productivity. There is nothing you can do to alter the number of children being monitored per worker because it's enshrined in the law. So in a sense, the productivity of childcare is fixed by law, right? Which means the only way to get more childcare is to get more workers. And people that have a proclivity to work with children don't want to work in early childcare because 2 reasons. 1, school districts pay more, better benefits, better hours. 2, the children are at least ostensibly more rational, better control over their bathroom functions. So no, I'm being serious. Childcare, you get paid significantly less than you would as a teacher to work with younger children who are, there's a certain ick factor associated with that. Let's be honest with it. So childcare tends to actually have very high turnover because people that work in a setting like a daycare, they're often people who are working on their teaching certificates. And then as soon as they get their teaching certificate, they go become a teacher. Okay, so it's very difficult to fix the cost of childcare because it's an industry that is almost impossible to adequately staff, right? So it's this chicken and the egg thing. You need more childcare workers so you can have more childcare so you can have more workers, right? Gen, alpha, beta. We don't really make any prognostications about the current child generation because we don't have any data on their work habits, right? We can start to see what Gen Z will be like as they turn 16, and we see at what rate are they working, what's their workforce proclivity like, but we don't have any data like that on children because of those pesky child labor laws. Although, again, like, it makes sense. You spend 3 minutes around my toddler and you're like, there's no way I would trust her in a coal mine to do anything, so it's probably good. Global power shifts, demographic shift. So the thing to remember is that birth rates have been in a state of collapse across essentially the entire, what we would call the developed world. Okay, they're very low in China, they're low in Japan, Korea, they're low across Europe and in Russia. So there really are no, even Iran's birth rate has dropped significantly. There's really nowhere outside of Africa that birth rates are still well surplus over replacement rates. So we're really facing global population decline. The UN thinks there will be a couple billion fewer people, a century from now. And so this is not a uniquely American phenomenon. Frankly, America's doing a lot better than many other countries. Our birth rate's higher than, for example, Japan or Germany or China. And America is a country that has high desirability for immigrants. So that's at least an element of our toolbox for dealing with population decline. Okay, I think we've touched on everything and we're roughly at time. So I will thank you for your attention and I hope you have a good day.